Sveiki įsijungę naujausią Lietuva Amerika seriją, kai visą šiandieną kalbuosiu su gerbiamu Karžygiu, Žygimantu Pavilioniu ir vėliau šiandieną serijoje kalbėsime su garsiuoju ir žurnalistu, ir think tankininku, bet galų gale svarbiausia yra tai, kad jis yra didžiausias Lietuvos, tai yra tiksliau kovotojas už Lietuvą nuo mūsų nepriklausomybės užsienyje. Ir be to šiame pokalbyje, kurį išgirsite vėliau, išgirsite ir linksmų ir juokingų anekdotų apie mane ir mano šeimą. Tai tikrai neišjunkite serijos ir pradedam žygį nuo mūsų pokalbio. Iš dalies apžvelkime, kas įvyko Lietuvoje, pasaulyje per pastarąją savaitę. Atrodo viskas čia bruzo pasaulyje, atrodo, kad pergalės kažkokios vyksta Irane, artimuosiuose rytuose su Izraelio ir Amerikos ganėtinai sėkmingų, sakykime, vienos iš blogio ašies galvų nukirtimų. Bet kas bus toliau? Kaip jūs manote?
Būtent žygį, ne karžygį, paprasčiau, visi mes čia karžygiai, visa Lietuva yra tokia, o kalbant apie tuos karus, tai, žinai, karai nuolat tęsiasi, tik aišku, ne kiekvieną kartą turim tokią administraciją, Amerikoje, kuri tos kalavijus pakelia. Ir man toks jausmas, kad mes lyg neišnaudojam šito momento. Vietoj to, kad atsimink, buvo daug tų pakelimų. Aš atsimenu net taip sunkiai, gan ir skausmingai per šeimas, kalbėsim apie šeimas ir giminės, kai amerikiečiai veržėsi į Iraką, mano amžinatilsį tėvelis tuo metu prisirakino grandinėmis prie Daukanto aikštės, jis buvo prieš įsiveržimą, aš buvau diplomatas, aš buvau labai už, nes mes visi manėme, kad tai atvers ir atvėrė mums kelius į NATO. Tada, kai buvo visa Europa susiskaldžius, prancūzai, vokiečiai ėjo prieš amerikiečius frontu, mes stojome į Amerikos pusę, mes nuvažiavome į Iraką kartu su jais ir mes įstojome į NATO. Tai nors, kad ir kaip čia kritikuoja konservatorius, kad mes labai nemėgstam kartais prezidento Nausėdos, bet pavyzdžiui jo ir jo pozicija, jų patarėjų pozicija, kad mes žinoma, kad jeigu jie mus paprašys, amerikiečiai, mes paremsime juos, aišku, svarstysime formas ir visą kitą, tarsimės kaip valstybė, bet manau yra labai svarbi, nes kai amerikiečiai yra kare, jie atsimena, kas su jais sunkiausių jiems metu buvo, nes tas karas gali įvairiai pasibaigti. Ir kainos kyla naftos, ir rinkimai Amerikoje artėja. Tai Trumpas rizikuoja, bet visi sutinka, kad jis daro gerą darbą, ko, vėl čia norisi man savo mylimą ar nemylimą Obamą rodyti iš nuotraukų. Jisai, aš atsimenu, aš sėdžiu Vašingtone, jisai sako, su Irano ajatolomis reikia draugauti, reikia apsikabinti, mes juos gerumu ir diplomatiją paveiksim. Su visa pagarba, kas tai buvo 14 metais, prieš 12 metų, tie 12 metų meilės tik tai išaugino ajatoloms sparnelius, išaugino jų kariuomenės raketas, kurios ir padarė lemtingą klaidą su spalio 7 įsiverždami į Izraelį. Tai, žodžiu, aš manau, kad mes turime būti su jais, o tuo tarpu mūsų raudonoji vyriausybė pasinaudoja progą, kad sukritikuoti ministrą Budrį, eilinį kartą pabrėžiu, kad jis čia blogai matai.
Prieš užjudant į šitą temą, norisi labai pabrėžti, labai aiškiai, ką jūs iš dalies jau pasakėte, yra tai, kad šie įvykiai Irane gali ir turėtų būti Lietuvos diplomatijos, sakykime, galimybę. Ar ne? Mes turime čia tikrai progą, kur galime parodyti, kurioj istorijos pusėje mes stovime. Ir taip ir turėtų elgtis mūsų valdžia, mūsų vyriausybė, bet atrodo, kad kažkaip taip nevyks. Atrodo, kad yra kažkoks ten, kaip minimum konsensuso nebuvimas vyriausybei, o maksimum užsienio politikos tiesiog nebuvimas ir neegzistavimas.
Aš sakyčiau, bent jau, jeigu mes sakom, kad, gerai, kai kurie gal čia nemyli to Trumpo administracijos, bet, pavyzdžiui, Mercas, mūsų pagrindinis saugumo lyderis, jis turbūt arčiausiai pasakė, kad ir ką mes čia galvotume apie viską, mes kaip europiečiai buvom vis laik labai silpni, mes tik daug kalbėdavom dėl artimų rytų, mes turime būti su Amerika, o mūsų ta kairiųjų pozicija yra kažkur tarp Merco ir ispanų to socialisto. nes ispanų socialistas sukritikavo Trumpą, o mes kažkur per vidurį. Tai tas per vidurį baigėsi tuo, kad tie palestiniečių vaikai iš tolimos kairės prieš patį Budrį vakarą organizuoja demonstraciją su Palestinos karom, kur jie buvo, kai 30 000 ar 40 000 laisvų iraniečių buvo išžudyti. Kažkaip apie tai nieks nekalba. Tai tiesiog mes tampam tokie jokie. Tas pats pasakytina ne tik apie šitą milžinišką konfliktą, prisiminkime Baltarusiją. Kiek raudonųjų galvų, nuo Andriukaičio iki pat jų dabartinio lyderio Sinkevičiaus, iki pat tos Ruginienės, kuri ten norėjo, abejojo, ar iš tikrųjų čia tos sankcijos turi būti Baltarusijai pratęstos. Na, ačiū Dievui, ES išgelbėjo mūsų garbę ir mes pratęsėm tas sankcijas, bet visą laiką lyg žaidėme kitoje pusėje. Na ir pabaigai ta pati Ukraina. Praeitą savaitę buvo 4. invazijos ir pradėjom 5. tikrosios invazijos ir 13 karo metus Rusijos prieš Ukrainą. Mes buvom Kijeve ir, žinai, aš taip apsidairau, šiaip lietuvių buvo daug, kokie, 5 salėj, bet tarp jų visa dabartinė opozicija, Ingrida, Viktorija, visas moterų delegacija, mes su Laurynu, taip pat vienas socialdemokratas, Rimantas Sinkevičius, NSGK pirmininkas, mūsų atvežtas, bet nesimato lyderių. Mes Verchovno Radoje buvo didžiulis minėjimas, Lenkų naujas kairysis Seimo vadas, nuėmė visą šlovę, Oleko nėra, nors aš žinau, kad jis buvo kviestas. Premjerės nėra, yra kažkoks Kaunas, kurį galbūt žino keli žmonės Vilniui, ar Kaune šiek tiek daugiau, bet Ukrainoje, jo tiesiog nesimatė. Jis ten buvo kažkur Maidane, kampe, juodai apsirengęs, bet aš jo nemačiau, nuoširdžiai, aš net jo nemačiau. Prezidentui, žinomi, vyko nelaimė, apibendrinus, net ir Ukrainoje mūsų nėra. Mūsų tiesiog, kadangi, dar aš nepaminėjau Žemaitaičio ir jo meilės Orbanui, taip sakant, kuris visai kitą pusę laivelį tempia ir dar su Kapčiamiešiu balsavimu gali įrodyti, kokioje pusėje jis iš tikrųjų yra, tai jau žiūrėk, 3 užsienio politikos yra ministro, Budrio ir Nausėdos, yra raudonųjų, nežinau kaip čia įvardinti, komisarų, yra Andriukaičių ir yra dar Žemaitaičio. Tai tas laivelis stovi vietoje, jis traukėmės į 3 pusės ir iš tikrųjų jis stovi vietoje ir niekur nejuda. Mes nepasinaudojame tom galimybėm, nes kiekvienas karas yra galimybė. Ta pasako gynybos komisaras, kurį vėl sutikau Kijeve, Kubilius, kuris visą laiką krizę priimdavo kaip galimybę.
Tai tada taip paprastai įvardinsiu. Buvo Kijeve lietuvių, bet lietuviai tie patys kaip ir visada. Mūsiškiai, konservatoriai, krikdemai, liberalai, mūsų gynybos komisaras Kubilius, kuris atstovauja visos Europos gynybos politiką. Bet dabartinės valdžios Lietuvoje, kuri iš tiesų turi gali kažką daryti Lietuvos lygmeniu, visiškai to nebuvo. Kodėl taip yra? Aš suprantu, kad ką jūs ten sakot apie šitą laivelį, kuris traukėsi visas pusės ir dėl to nejuda iš vietos, bet kaip tai atsitiko? Nenormalu.
Vincentai, vienas iš mūsų populiariausių podcastų buvo, kai mes su tavim apibendrinom pirmojo premjero Palucko žlugimą Labanore prie Židinio. Aš kažkokį turiu jausmą, kad šiame pavasarį, kuris pavasaris bus ne tik Irane, bet ir Lietuvoje. Aš manau, kad šita vyriausybė gali subirėti į šipulius, nes artėja toks jausmas, kad jie visą energiją leidžia pjautynėms viduje. Jie nesutarė, jie nekenčia viens kito, jie negali kartu veikti ir todėl, kai tu visą energiją leidi pykčiui tarpusavyje, ne valstybės valdymoje, tuo labiau ne reakcija į užsienio politiką, tavęs tiesiog nieks nemato, tai nieks nesupranta, kur iš tikrųjų yra tikroji Lietuva. Jinai pjaunasi viduje, o tai rusams, Maskvai, Lukašenkai, Pekinui yra idealiausias variantas. Žiūrėk, pabaigai paskutinis toks labai keistas epizodas, realiai mes supratome, kad premjerė visa jėga sukritikavo ministrą Budrį, kuris padarė šventą ir teisingą dalyką. Kai jinai čianai skeričiodamasi kalbėjo apie tai, kad reikia atsiklaupti ant kelių komunistiniam Pekinui, Budrys su 50 šalių lyderių Vašingtone susitarė, kad reikia daryti viską, kad sukurti tos kritinių mineralų nepriklausomybę nuo Kinijos. O premjerė už tai sukritikavo Budrį. Tai mes ką nenorime atsiplėšti nuo komunistinio Pekino, mes grįžtame prie tų savo komunistinių šaknų. Kodėl Budrys taiga netinka šiuo esminiu atveju, kai jis jau antrą kartą Vašingtone bando tas beveik užsidariusias durelės raudoniesiem praverti, jis dar vis laiko koją įkišti, ar mes norime tą koją nukirsti?
Apmaudu ir apgailėtina, bet aš manau, kad šiandienos serijos antroji dalis tikrai daug duoda ir vilties, ir parodo, kad ir, aš manau, dabartinė mūsų valdžia yra užstrigus šitą mąstymą, kad mes esame mažiukai, mes nieko patys negalime padaryti ir todėl sekame, kaip be papūs vėjas, bet šiandieną, kaip kalbėjo Edward Lucas, tikrai parodo, kad mes galime, jeigu tik yra ryžto ir noro. Tad Žygi, paskutinės 3 minutės papasakokit truputį, kas yra tas mūsų nuostabusis svečias, su kuriuo taip buvo man miela ir smagu kalbėtis ir kuris irgi taip smagiai, sakykime, prisimena mano šeimą.
Būtinai papasakok apie tą epizodą, nes kai jis pasakys, vis tiek tauta nesupras, ką jis ten pasakė apie tavo senelį. Na, o man Edward Lucas, žinok, yra pats turbūt mieliausias Britas, kurį esu pažinęs per visą savo istoriją, kai niekas mūsų negirdėjo, kai šaipėsi iš mūsų antirusiškumo, jisai parašė knygas apie tai, kad privalome grįžti vos ne prie šalto karo su Rusija, kai mūsų rusai čia tiesiog žemino, jis buvo tas Britas, kuris žadino premjerus, baigim, griaukim šitos Londongradus rusiškus, baigim daryti su rusais pinigais, tęskime savo kovą už laisvę. Dabar jau visa Britanija eina Edward Lucas keliais, visas pasaulis bando eiti Edward Lucas keliais, o dar istoriškai jisai buvo ta asmenybė, kuri stebėjo visas mūsų nepriklausomybės kovas iš Vilniaus, iš čia tuo metu fiziškai ir gyveno, jis matė sausio 13 ir neužmiršiu, paskutinis epizodas, aš su juo darau sausio 13 20-metį Vašingtone, bandydamas priminti apie mūsų išsilaisvinimo kovas amerikiečiam, Museum, žiniasklaidos muziejui, ir jis taip gražiai pasakė ten su Rita Miliūtė, keliais kitais žurnalistais, realiai tuo metu sausio 13 mes žurnalistai jūs išgelbėjom, nes mes paskelbėm žinią pasaulyje apie tos baisius žudymus jūsų stovinčių prie televizijos bokšto su vėliavom, su dainom. Ir tai jūs padarėte absoliučiai istoriją, nes jūs esate pirmoji tauta sustabdžiusi raudonąją armiją su savo laisvu protestu. Tai sausio 13 buvo Sovietų sąjungos pabaigos pradžia. Ir jūs tai padarėt, ne vengrai, ne čekai, ne lenkai, jūs lietuviai. Ir už tai jūs per amžius gerbiu. Ir jis taip pasakė Vašingtone, kai visi linksėjo, taip. Bet kokia ta istorija buvo, Vincentai, su tavo seneliu, papasakok. Kas čia buvo?
Patikslinti, ten nebuvo mano senelis, tiksliau tai buvo mano tėvas, kuris tuo metu dirbdamas. Taip, tai buvo mano tėvas, Edwardas Palubinskas, kuris tuo metu dirbdamas tuometinės aukščiausios tarybos info biure, tuo metu buvo Amerikos pilietis ir kaip Lietuvos, tiksliau Amerikos lietuvis, grįžęs kovoti ir dirbti su sąjūdžiu, buvo labai daug tokio pykčio iš į Lietuvą sugrįžusių Amerikos lietuvių, būtent Amerikos atžvilgiu, kad tuo metu dar buvo žaidžiami tie kažkokie rusiški žaidimai, kad lietuviai neišsiubuokit laivo per daug, bus blogai.
Pasilikit su Gorbačiovu, nesukilkit.
Taip. O tėvas, kaip ir dabar, taip ir tada, labai principingas, švelniai tariant, pasiuntė ant 3 raidžių tuometinius amerikonų atstovus Lietuvoje.
Pagarba. Tėvas, matai, man niekad nepasakojo apie tą. Aš galvoju, čia senelis tavo vicepirmininkas Seimo. Jo, geras, super. Atpažįstu Aidą, atpažįstu.
Tikrai taip. Taigi, ačiū labai Žygi už pokalbį ir klausytojams linkiu geros likusios serijos, būtinai.
Žygi, sveiki, hello.
Labas, sveiki. So I know 30 minutes, precious time, and okay, let me start maybe introducing Vincentas. Vincentas is third generation Lithuanian American. His grandfather, maybe you even remember, Christian Democrat grandfather. He was deputy speaker during independence period. So this is the third generation that helps me with podcasts. So this is it. And
I think, Vincentus, I think I met you. Was your dad working in the info bureau in the SAMUS in the
Absolutely.
early 90s? I remember.
You're right.
I think, wasn't he the guy who told the American ambassador to fuck off?
That wouldn't surprise me.
I think I remember that.
That's good. Okay,
I'll ask him about that sometime.
I will. Certainly. Well,
good. We're getting off to a great start, so I'm ready. Go ahead.
Okay, indeed. All right. So, first of all, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. And before we get into the nitty-gritty of all the questions that are bugging us these days, if you could give us a brief, or give our listeners a brief introduction as to who you are, and in fact, what an incredible history and strong relationship that you have with Lithuania.
Well, I have been campaigning for the freedom and security of what we used to call the captive nations since the 1970s as a teenager. And I first came to Lithuania in January 1990. I was working for the British newspaper, The Independent then. I came back on the 28th of March 1990 and got Lithuanian visa 0001, which was a great honor. I lived in Lithuania for most of the early 90s, and I speak a bit of Lithuanian. I'm always trying to improve it. And I now run a new think tank called the Baltic International Security Center, which is aimed at trying to rebut some of these facile, doom-mongering narratives we see in the West, and make the Old West understand that the Baltic states are not a problem, they're the solution. So my basic message to the world is be more Baltic.
Edward, can I just continue that? Because our podcast will be released on the eve of March 11th, when we declared our independence. You saw us like, I don't know, already 40 years. What can you say? Are we on track? Everything is okay or not okay?
I think the first thing to say is that Lithuania has never in its history been safer. It's never in its history been richer. It's never been better connected. It's never been happier, and it's never been better informed. And these are enormous achievements over 36 years. I think if the Grand Duke Gediminas were to come back today, he might say, "What have you done with the rest of my country?" Because it's got a bit smaller. But he would be amazed, and not just at modernity, but also about the many other things. So Lithuania, like Latvia and Estonia, is basically a great success story, and a success achieved in the teeth of a lot of patronizing skepticism who said these tiny ex-Soviet Baltic republics are too small, too traumatized, too backward, wrong neighborhood, they're never going to make it. And so that's very good. Now, there's a lot more to do. I worry about the lack of air defenses on the military side. I think there's room for better command and control, more sort of tighter lines of communication on the military side. The convergence on the EU average has slowed a bit. So this fantastic growth we've seen in recent years is not quite as good as it used to be, although it's still pretty good. And coming from a country like Britain, I feel when I'm going from Britain to Lithuania, I'm going from kind of, I describe this, mucked up Europe to functioning Europe, where the trains in Lithuania work. There's a kind of frictionless, the state operates a platform in which people can get on with their lives and make money in a very frictionless way. And I should also mention the unicorns. We now have world famous companies that are based in Lithuania, particularly Vinted. So I don't want any complacency, and I think we've seen doses of complacency perhaps in Estonia, which used to be the kind of leading Baltic country and got perhaps went a bit off the boil in recent years. So keep going, keep the focus, keep the vision. I'd like to see more ambition for Lithuania, but I sincerely believe the best is yet to come.
What I'm really itching to ask you, in a sense, and I'm sure Zhig is under the current wants to poke at the same thing, is the idea that, do you think we're doing enough? And I mean this by underlining the fact that Lithuania was often known and seen as the sort of trailblazer of the post-Soviet space, bringing the captive nations, as you said, to the West, to freedom, to democracy, to liberal markets, and things like this. But right now, as we like to criticize very often, the current government that seems completely, at the very least, feckless, at the very worst, completely counterproductive to what we need in this current and very unstable time for the region.
Well, I'm certainly not going to get into discussing the current government. One of my rules, which I have adopted over many years in dealing with Lithuania, is never get involved in domestic political or other quarrels, because the winners won't thank you and the losers will never forgive you. So I think that the Lithuania's had tough patches politically in the past, and I remember the early 90s as a time when the country seemed absolutely stagnant. It was very, very, very troubling indeed. And we also had the extraordinary episode of the short-lived President Paksas and his government. But I think that the key thing is that Lithuania has strong institutions, it has a very strong civil society, and there's a lot of momentum, and different governments will try to do different things, and if people don't like it, they complain, and the government will either change its mind or lose the next election, as the previous government found out. So I think the things that I see as most important are to get across the message that Lithuania is a safe country, and that is not completely understood in Lithuania or abroad. So one very important point is Lithuania's borrowing costs are basically the same as France. And France is a G7 country that's been around for many, many centuries, and you only got back on the world map in 1991. And the fact that your 10-year Euro bond is heavily oversubscribed when it was issued, that your corporates can borrow, and this is true for the whole B3, it's not just Lithuania. The markets are not putting any noticeable geopolitical risk premium on lending to you, and that's very important. I think another thing that's very important is that it could be a lot better, because the capital markets are so underdeveloped, and the Baltic Nasdaq is categorized as a frontier market along with Burkina Faso and Senegal. No disrespect to those African countries, but given the B3's living standards and institutional development, you should be in the same bracket as Poland as an emerging market. And that's something that I'm working on. So I think there's some sort of important, rather unglamorous structural things that need working on, particularly at a B3 level, and B3 cooperation is still surprisingly low given the last 36 years. There's a great deal of scope for improvement on that.
Okay, let's maybe start speaking big picture, because for me, you are the person that lives in the West but understands the East the best. But also, when you go to the East, you help us to, interpret the West also the best way. Let's start with the West. UK, British people, diplomats, for me, they were the first to knock to my little diplomatic doors in '93 and say, Žygis, be ambitious, go to UN, NATO, we will help you. I was just learning how to, write first verbal notes on computer, and you've been encouraging me to join the clubs. And now, with this strange transatlantic relations with Donald Trump and America, I would love to see Brits playing this, I don't know, getting family together role. I don't feel it. So, what's the future of our transatlantic family that you know, so well from inside? When I served in America, they were saying me, actually, British Empire are our eyes, how we feel and see Europe, and vice versa. What's the role of United Kingdom for the future? Because I see that you are becoming little by little more and more like Norway. Would you ever come back to us? Because we need you. You built all the
Well,
coalitions inside. So the
well,
future of the West.
Zhigis,
Ever.
you've asked 7 questions in that
Well,
by my count, so I'm not going to answer them all at once.
okay.
First of all, I don't think there is such a thing as the West anymore, and it was always a very, I think, convenient but rather misleading shorthand. But certainly under the Trump administration, we see a lot of fragmentation. Alliances are based on shared history, which you can't take away, but trust, which can go very quickly, and self-interest. And I think that the trust has been shattered by Trump's rhetoric, and particularly on things like Greenland. And the self-interest is not at all clear. That the Americans don't see it as in their self-interest to be the front stop, and possibly not even the backstop of European security. And they don't understand that having a big US-led alliance with the Europeans is a plus for the United States. They feel the Europeans are basically useless allies. And the Europeans are realizing that having the United States as a security hegemon is not just a free ticket to better security, that you may be sold weapons that won't work when you need them, for example. So there's a lot of discontent there and a lot of rearrangement. I think that Britain is in a very difficult position because we are joined at the hip with the United States, particularly on intelligence and nuclear issues. So it's really hard for us to have a row with the Americans as we're having at the moment. And it's easier for France to do stuff that's independent. I think that really what's happened is that the lessons of Suez have been reversed. After the Suez debacle of 1956, the French said, we'll never trust the Americans again. And the Brits said, we'll never have a row with the Americans again. And that worked mainly in our favor over the next nearly 70 years. And now it's the other way around, and it looks like being a go-list is pretty advantageous. And we see from Macron, he's able to use the very flexible French nuclear deterrent in a sort of new French nuclear diplomacy. And our nuclear deterrent is really very heavily tied to the Americans. And so, in addition, we also have a very weak government in Britain. So I don't see Britain playing a major role in this. We are stuck with the Americans whether we like it or not. We can't therefore have a leadership role in Europe, and that leaves a bit of a vacuum. And maybe France will fill it, maybe Poland, maybe Germany.
Understood. But actually, you raised quite a good point when you bring up Europe. So what Gis and I wanted to talk to you a little bit when we were discussing before the podcast. Essentially, what we're seeing right now is that we need, obviously, a stronger Europe that's able to take care of itself without being overly reliant on the systems that we used to religiously rely on. That requires strong integration and collaboration between not only the EU, but the UK as well, and extra EU countries. We saw maybe the first steps of that when your Prime Minister Starmer came up with the idea of the coalition of the willing to actually keep Ukraine on the agenda of the day. What do you think of that? Is that enough? Is that actually a right step, or is it more talk and posturing while we're still waiting for the Americans to hopefully get their act together and come back on board?
Well, first of all, I don't think there's any point in waiting for the Americans to come back on board. I think even if we get a American administration which is easier to deal with, I don't think the sort of days of the high Clinton era are coming back. There's just too much going on, and the American public just isn't really interested in what they see as subsidizing other countries' security. So I'd be very cautious on that. I'm also very dubious that the coalition of the willing means anything. I think that in terms of boots on the ground, to be a serious contributor to the security of a post-ceasefire Ukraine, you would need 100,000 troops. You're talking about several armored divisions or a corps, and that would multiply that by 3, because you have people preparing to go on deployment and people coming back from deployment. And Europe just doesn't have those forces. Britain certainly doesn't. If we were struggling to keep 1,000 troops, which is a battalion, in Estonia, so the idea that we could deploy a serious force in Ukraine is nuts. You could try and do it through deterrence with a sort of sky shield and lots of advanced weapons in Ukraine, but not many people. The problem with that is we don't have the stocks for that. We have fantastic weapons for the first few days of the war, and then we phone up the Americans and say, can we have some more? And as we've seen in Iran, these stockpiles are not as great as they should be, and they burn out very quickly. And they also risk the question, are you really willing to go to war with Russia? If you put high-tech weapons in to guarantee a Ukraine ceasefire, and a Russian drone hits your one of your installations, and do you then shoot back at the place where the drone was launched from? And I think the fundamental problem with the so-called West, or with Europe, is we're not willing to confront Russia. In the end, we're scared of Russia's nuclear escalation. And so long as that remains the case, we won't defend Ukraine, and we won't actually defend ourselves properly.
This is exactly the point I wanted to dig in, talking the East. I'm just back from Ukraine, and this is 5th war of full invasion, but I always have a feeling that it's not so bad when it comes there, because people are fighting, but like a good pupil of people like you, like former diplomat who devoted part of my life to integrate Lithuania into EU and NATO, I want to do the same with Ukraine. But do you think we will succeed with this project if we are not rejecting this, strange Freudistic love for Russian Empire? Like, I was reading in history books that Brits and French, they were saving Ottoman Empire for some strange reasons, and now it disappeared and nothing happened. But I have a feeling that the big West is still saving Russian Empire from collapse. And like Lithuanians, Poles, whoever, Ukrainians living here, we ask why? Why do you need to save new kind of Hitler regime of 21st century? Why? It's time to collapse. So do you think can we rescue Ukraine with this strange Freudistic love for Russian Empire in our hearts?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that the West is terrified of the breakup of Russia. And I remember at the start of the Ukraine war talking to people in big Western countries, which I won't mention, but closer to Lithuania than to Britain, who said our main worry is that this could lead to smuta, this time of troubles, of chaos. And they said our main aim is to avoid this. We mustn't humiliate Russia. We don't want Russia to break up, because that would be so chaotic. Once you go to the countries that live next to Russia, they are not sanguine about the prospect of smuta, but they also know that there are other things that are much worse. So if you've experienced Russian or Soviet occupation, you know that you will risk anything to avoid that happening again. And so that difference in risk appetite is extremely important. You've also got the commercial interests. Now we see even in Lithuania, there are people who sort of wonder about maybe doing a bit of business with Belarus or something. So the greed will bite everywhere. But there is much more greed for cheap gas and for the big Russian market when you go to some of the other European countries. And you put that together, and there's a very big difference in outlook. I would also say that one of the big worries is that geopolitics has become an elite preoccupation. So people like us in Germany and France and wherever still worry about Russia. We probably worry about China. We want to spend more on defense. We want to do more. The public is increasingly not seeing it that way. They say, we're bored with this. We would like cheap gas, lower prices and less hassle. We want to stop having to worry about it. So please, you guys, you're in charge, calm it down. And that's very dangerous.
Well, it is dangerous, but it seemed at the beginning of the full-scale invasion that the voices of the so-called eastern flank of the Western world had gotten through a little bit to minds in both London, Berlin, Paris. It seemed rather that at the time, the policymakers had started listening to us and had admitted even that we were wrong. We should have listened to the Lithuanians, the Latvians, when they said that don't play nice with the Russians because they won't play nice with you. So are we kind of backtracking again? Have they stopped listening to us again? And if so, what do we do to keep them on side?
It's absolutely true that after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a lot of people were willing to admit the Baltic states and other countries in the same position were right. You warned us, we didn't listen, we're sorry. That doesn't mean that they actually listen now, unfortunately. And so we are in a strange position that rather like Cassandra, with the smoke is rising over Troy, and the Trojans are saying to Cassandra, yes, you're right about that horse. But anyway, we've got other things to worry about. And I think it's difficult. In the end, people change their minds because they're scared or angry or greedy. Those are the sort of main things that do it. And there's no real financial motive to do national security properly. There's no penalty. You don't have the bond markets won't lend you money because you don't have a whole of society or whole of government defense model. And although they were a bit angry about Ukraine, they're not really angry and they're not scared. And so we still have the same complacent attitude where you do as much as you need to keep the Americans off your back, or maybe not even that, now that no one really cares about what the Americans think. You are, and you don't really think about your lack of air defenses. You don't really think about your lack of an escalatory response in the sub-threshold area. You just want to get on with life as normal, and politicians tend to follow the public mood. In normal cases, occasionally you get a sort of Churchillian sort of burst of leadership, but that's quite rare. So I'm not optimistic about the Old West's ability to defend itself. But I would say, and this is very important for you in Lithuania, just the NBP9, the countries around the Baltic Sea, the four Nordics, leave out Iceland for now, the Poles and the three Baltic states, you have a GDP bigger than Russia. And you all see it basically the same way. And you can afford to defend yourselves. And you may need to think again on nuclear weapons. You may need to sacrifice quite a lot of national sovereignty in terms of defense planning. But you have all the elements you need. This is not like you're up against China. You're up against an economy that's basically the size of Italy and quite badly stretched. So there's no reason for panic in the Baltic Sea region. You can do it plenty even without the Germans or the French or the Brits. But you are going to need to break a sweat.
And my last question, Edward, I know you don't want to speak about Lithuanian politics, but I want to speak about UK. My son is still living in London, second son returned, and I was not impressed. Like, okay, we met in London when I was there with my United Folkgreen team. I was impressed by political answers. All parties more or less said what I want to hear, but they're not putting money on that. Like, when Finnish chairman was laughing at British counterpart saying, I have 1 million of reserve army. How big is your army today? Where are your percentages of defense? My son was complaining that, economy is not going well. And I'm conservative. I see my conservative counterparts sinking in polls instead of very much growing. I see Labour is sinking. I see new parties like yours and EU Reform emerging. So is it kind of what's happening in Britain? Will you transform? Will you be back? Because we are addicted on UK. Our
Yeah.
biggest immigration drives are in London right now, not in Chicago. We love you guys. You are like
Yeah.
us. We want you to be strong. What's happening with you?
I know. Well, I mean, as a patriotic citizen of this country, I find it very upsetting. And I have to say, I feel safer in Lithuania than I do in Britain, actually, these days. We are in our defences are in a really terrible, terrible mess. Years of underspending and spending money on the wrong things. And the criminal justice system is struggling to keep track of just regular crime, let alone the sort of weaponized crime that the Russians are up to. And we don't tell the public the truth. There is a lot going on in the sub-threshold space, which the authorities don't talk about because they're afraid. They say they're afraid of creating panic. I think what they're really afraid of is the public would turn around and say, why did you let this happen and what are you going to do about it? So that's bad. And it particularly affects you because of the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is meant to be UK led. But it's been clear in the last sort of year and a half that really there isn't much British leadership in JEF, and we are going to have to think again about how that functions. I would say I'm older than the two of you put together, I suspect. So I remember the 70s very clearly and doing my school homework by candlelight because the power had gone out because of the miners being on strike. And so the pendulum swings backwards and forwards, and people thought Britain was finished in the 70s, and then we got Mrs. Thatcher. And so I think one should never, just as one shouldn't overestimate the importance of success, one should also not be overly gloomy about when things are going badly. There's a lot of things in Britain which are just still remain fantastic. And I think we probably have got a few more difficult years to go before things snap back. We may have a government that's worse than this before we get something better. But we've been around for more than 1,000 years. So I suspect we'll muddle through somehow. But I worry very much about the countries that look to us for leadership. And you're right, we played an important leadership role in the 90s and the noughties. And we're quite good at the beginning of the Ukraine war. And so I'm afraid we need your advice now. And one of the things I'm doing with my think tank is to try and get people in the Old West to look again at what the Baltic states are doing on vigilance, readiness, cohesion, and so on, and hope that will maybe transplant back to Britain.
Amen to that. Thank you once again, Mr. Lucas, for joining us on this podcast. It would be wonderful to keep in touch and maybe even do this again if you would be willing.
Sure. I'm probably wrong about everything. So remember what I've said, and in 6 months come back and you can tell me. It was a pleasure being here. Adieu. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. You've been speaking from London. I'm in Vilnius and Vincentas is in Bologna. So this is Europe I love. But we still have to develop our potential. Thank you so much, Edward. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.